So I said yesterday that I was going to say a bit more about the manifest image and the scientific image, because I think, especially on the topic of free will, it's very important to get clear about what the difference is between them, and they're both perfectly real. Let me just remind you of a few things that are in the manifest image. Colors. Colors are part of our manifest image unless we're colorblind. Living things and agents. Opportunities. There are opportunities in the manifest image. That's one of the things that we recognize. Free will. Dollars. There's dollars, perfectly good things. Scientific image has proteins and atoms and quarks and maybe strings. We'll get around to that. And so here's a whole bunch of different things, and they're obviously very different. Opportunities and dollars are not very much like atoms and quarks. And they all, as Stephen was saying yesterday, they're all real in some sense, but maybe they're different senses. And the question of how to negotiate back and forth between the two images is the problem that Sellers recommends to philosophers, and I think he's right, and I take myself to be involved in helping people see how to get back and forth between these two images. And free will is one of the most important ones. But there's two approaches. Let's go back from, there's the hard-nosed approach and the diplomatic approach. The hard-nosed approach says, from the scientist, X doesn't exist, it's just an illusion. It doesn't exist. Colors don't exist. The alternative is, well, it exists, but it's quite different from what tradition supposes. Now, look at a few cases and decide for yourself how you would go on these. Time. Does it exist?
It does.
But it isn't quite what people think it is, right?
It may or may not be, but it certainly exists.
Yeah. Causation.
It doesn't exist.
How about color?
Apparently he's going to give the answers.
Yeah. Color.
Color exists, sure.
Yeah. Even though atoms, even though fermions and bosons aren't colored.
Does time
Okay.
exist in time? No.
All right. How about dollars? They exist. Euros, yeah. Okay. So it seems that people here aren't very hard-nosed about this. They tend to take the opposite. But when it comes to free will,
Well, the mad dog naturalist might take the hard
well,
nose
indeed.
stuff.
But when it comes to free will, what I've discovered in the last few years is there's a veritable army, a veritable chorus of distinguished neuroscientists and other scientists that say, take the hard-nosed approach to this. They say, free will doesn't exist, it's an illusion. And I think they're making some huge mistakes, and I want to just outline them briefly. Well, why do they think so? Well, let's look at Dilbert for a minute. This epitomizes the free will issue. Think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? Well, of course. And how can we blame people for their actions? Because people have free will to do as they choose. Are you saying that free will is not part of the brain? Of course it is, but it's the part of the brain that's out there just being kind of free. Love the hand waving there. So you're saying the free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of science, physics? Obviously, otherwise we couldn't blame people for anything they do. You think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? Shut up.
His tail is wagging.
Yeah. Yeah. Dilbert says, shut up. All right. Now, I think that actually captures the quandary of the free will problem really very well. We have all the elements that give people a problem. And here's my tentative diagnosis of what these neuroscientists and others are doing. They argue these ideas seem to be incoherent. They're right. So free will must be an illusion. And I want to show there's a problem with this. I think free will is as real as colors and as real as dollars. But it's not quite what you think they are, any more than colors and dollars are what you think they are. So in order to get clear about what free will is, you have to abandon some of the ancient mythology, which is indeed incoherent. Here's Tom Wolfe, a canny observer of the social scene. Great phrase of his. the conclusion people out beyond the laboratory walls are drawing is, the fix is in, we're all hardwired. That, and don't blame me, I'm wired wrong. I think he's exactly right. That's the conclusion that is out beyond the laboratory walls. But I want to challenge it and say, look, oh, right, I left out a slide, I guess. Wired wrong? Okay, what would it be to be wired right? Is there any way that you could be wired right and have free will and have responsibility? That's really what the issue is. And I'm going to claim that nothing we've learned in neuroscience, nothing we've learned in naturalism shows that we can't be wired right for free will. But you have to understand something a little bit different by free will from what tradition would say. Everybody knows how to play rock, paper, and scissors. What's the best strategy?
There is no mixed strategy or no strategy.
Randomize. But we're lousy randomizers. So here's a good strategy. If you really were going to play this for money, go to a table of random numbers, copy down 100, memorize them or write them down on a piece of paper, consult them, go. You can't do better than that as long as you keep the piece of paper secret. Now, this idea of keeping your choices, having a poker face and keeping your choices hidden is, I think, deeply appreciated and is essential to the manifest image. But what's happened is that philosophers for several thousand years have thought it's not enough just to sort of keep your choices hidden. They've got to be completely hidden. They've got to be hidden absolutely. So you want to be somewhat unpredictable. And this has been inflated by philosophers for thousands of years into absolute unpredictability. Why? Because philosophers always inflate to absolutes when they can. It just makes life easier. Here's Jerry Fodor, for instance. One wants to be what tradition has it that Eve was when she bit the apple, perfectly free to do otherwise, so perfectly free, in fact, that even God couldn't tell which way she'd jump. Perfect expression of this inflated idea. Well, why does one want that? In other words, one wants a miracle. You can't have it, and you don't need it. All you need is to be unpredictable to the agents that you actually encounter. So let me sum up as a sort of challenge. If you think that indeterminism is required for free will, I think you're wrong, with one exception and one exception only. If you anticipate a future in which you think you are going to be playing rock, paper, and scissors for big stakes with God, then you better hope for quantum indeterminacy to play a role. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. A deterministic world is exactly as good as an indeterministic world. You can have just as much free will in a deterministic world as in an undetermined world, as long as you keep your list to yourself.
Dan, you know the Li and Wang experiments where monkeys play rock, paper, scissors against computers, and they monitor their brains, the neurons, in the occipital neurons? So basically, the monkeys implement an algorithm that gets as close to randomization when the computer's randomizing as a Rescorla-Wagner conditioned system can get, which is not perfect randomization, right? So the computer will gradually, if the monkey plays the computer for a long time, the computer will suck it out of money because it can't quite randomize, but it takes a long time. It's basically just about as good as randomizing.
Yeah.
And that's the neural fire, right? We're talking.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, because I think I'm missing something extremely essential here. What if I'm trying to do something which I call make a choice and nobody's in the room? So how is obscuring my thoughts from other agents relevant to that?
It isn't relevant to that at that time, no. I'm saying, here's my hypothesis, that human beings for thousands of years have appreciated the value of a poker face. They have felt threatened whenever they see somebody who seems to be able to anticipate their decision making. If you've ever had a magician force a card on you, I hang around with card magicians some, and a friend of mine once did something he would never do in public. Very good card magician. He said, here, pick a card, any card, and he forced the 10 of diamonds on me. You know? Or I picked the 10 of diamonds, handed it back to him, shuffled the deck, just pick a card again. 10 of diamonds. Shuffle the deck, pick a card again, the 10 of diamonds. He forced the 10 of diamonds on me about 10 times in a row. And I was taking from the bottom of the deck, I was doing everything I could think of, and every time he anticipated me exactly right. It was extremely unnerving. I felt as if, my autonomy was really seriously abridged, and it was.
I'd like to ask the mirror image.
Well, before we start, I have a counter presentation, which I was supposed to give.
You have a what?
I'd like to hear just to
counter-
clarify if I
Oh.
could, Steve's
Okay,
point.
sure.
No, but if I could hear Steve's point, because I feel like I'm stuck at the beginning. I know you're going to get to your counter presentation, but.
Yeah.
Well-
I'll be through in a couple of minutes.
Sorry, I thought you were.
I'm not quite through. No.
Oh, I'm
I'm
sorry.
gonna- Well, why don't I just shut up?
Why don't I just finish and then you can all have at it.
All right.
Yeah, Here's this one more Dilbert slide, and I'm pretty much through. Free will is an illusion. Humans are nothing but moist robots. Just relax and let it happen. All right, moist robots. I think that's a great phrase. That's what we are. We're moist robots. That's what cognitive science, that's what naturalism says. Now, this is the conclusion that is out there, as Tom Wolfe says, in the zeitgeist. This is what people think follows from cognitive science and from a materialistic view of the mind. And I think it's very important that it doesn't follow. It just does not follow. And that, in fact, scientists who think it follows are committing a very simple sort of freshman mistake. They are confusing the ideology of the manifest image with the manifest image. The fact, Sean thinks there's colors, so do I. But if we let the ideology of the manifest image define the word color, then we'd have to say, oh, well then there's no colors. If that's what you mean by color, colors don't exist. If that's what you mean by consciousness, consciousness doesn't exist. If that's what you mean, but we don't say that. We say, well, the ideology of the manifest image is not accurate. People have been making mistakes. Don't take it at its face value and look at what the manifest image actually is, and you see that there are varieties of free will that people recognize and deal with every day. They make distinctions on the basis of it. These are robust concepts of free will that have zero to do with determinism and are perfectly consistent with determinism. They're compatible so that you can be a compatibilist in good conscience. What you have to give up is the idea that the ideology of the manifest image rules as far as defining the terms goes. It doesn't. Okay, I think that's it.
So what is the ideology of the manifest image?
I'll give you an example. How many of you think you are qualified to sign a contract? Of your own free will. Notice there's some people that aren't. There's a perfectly robust distinction in the manifest image between people who have enough free will to sign a contract and those that don't. There's the senile and the impaired in various ways, small children. They don't have the competence to sign a contract, but we do. Now let's think about signing a contract. So you sign a contract of your own free will. And if I don't, there's a penalty clause of some sort. And you don't fulfill your side of the bargain, and the person comes back and says, hey, wait a minute. You haven't done your side of the bargain. You say, well, sue me. The guy sues you, you lose, and you say, collect. If you pursue this line, eventually you're going to go to jail. Now, when you go to jail, it is not for rehabilitation. It's not to keep you out of the hands, it's not to protect the public from you. It is punishment.
It's deterrence.
Well, yes, but it is deterrence of those who have actually violated the law.
A deterrence would serve just as well if you weren't punished, but everybody.
Sorry,
thought you
I'm
had.
going to steal that.
Yeah.
Everybody what?
Thought he was.
So my claim is that there's a perfectly legitimate concept of free will, which is a somewhat political concept. We have, for the law, we have to draw boundaries, but we don't make the mistake of thinking that these are, we're carving nature at the joints. There's no joint there in nature. 16, you can drive a car, 15 and a half, you can't.
Are you familiar with the well-known paper by John Rawls, The Original Position, Political, Not Metaphysical?
Yeah.
That's what you're arguing.
I'm saying that free will is quite properly seen as falling right out of political facts which are available in the manifest image. None of us want to live without it. If you go around saying free will doesn't exist, free will is an illusion, you're actually undercutting the very glue of civilization. And that's the reason that people should be upset about it. If you don't believe that, you should learn about the experiments that have been done. I think with Wilson Schooler is the most striking, where undergraduates at Santa Barbara read one of two passages from Francis Crick's book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. One says, science has shown we don't have free will. You know, every decision you make is already determined by your brain. The other one, same length from the same book, but it says nothing about free will. Then the students are given an opportunity to make money by solving a puzzle. And it's pointed out to them that in fact there's a way to cheat. Please don't cheat, be honest. Which group cheats?
Once you read the free will.
The ones that were just told by Francis Crick, Nobel laureate, that they don't have free will. They cheat much more. And this is not an isolated result. There are a lot of these, and it's not so surprising. If science authoritatively tells people they don't have free will, people tend to believe that. And since they tend to believe that, they then don't think very hard about whether they really ought to do things. They think, you know, I'm sort of off the hook, you know, I'm a moist robot, just sit back and enjoy life. And so people's behavior degenerates into antisocial behavior as soon as they're convinced by
Well,
science.
and remember, this is the answers to questionnaire. It's not the way they behave. It's whether they do cheat, but
They
it's
do
not like,
cheat.
in 6 months, I challenge you to prove that those people are more immoral that are more cheating than other people. I mean, which has a short-term effect. Well, let me, are you through?
Well, I had my other little thought experiment that I thought I would run through. There is a chip you can put in your brain if you have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. It'll do it.
Chips in brains.
Yeah.
What?
You have a tendency to put chips in brains.
Yeah, well, that's sort of my stock and trade, yeah. But this is a real thing. So far, science fact. It'll really do a good job on curing your OCD. Preliminary, you know, but it's pretty good. So you imagine some poor fellow with OCD goes in, the neurosurgeon puts the chip in his brain, and then she says to him, oh yeah, your OCD is cured, but by the way, from now on, our 24/7 staff here at the control center are going to be controlling your every decision, every move. You're going to think you have free will, but that's just going to be an illusion. Actually, we're going to be making all the decisions for you. Goodbye. Out he goes. And he believes her. And so his behavior, he becomes sort of self-indulgent, he becomes negligent, lets his aggressions loose. In general, he behaves badly, and pretty soon he gets caught and he gets put on trial. He said, but I don't have free will, you know, the neurosurgeon said, you know, that I didn't have free will, it was just an illusion. They call the neurosurgeon, put the neurosurgeon on the stand, and she says, oh yeah, that's what I told him. Yeah. Oh, it's a complete lie. I was just messing with his head. I just wanted to see what would happen. I think we can agree she did a very bad thing.
But he's still responsible.
She ruined his life. She disabled him. She accomplished non-surgically what she claimed to accomplish surgically. She disabled him as a responsible agent.
Only because he didn't know the nature of free will.
Right. But now we have this chorus of neuroscientists going around telling, science has shown you don't have free will. And I put it to them, tell me, if that imaginary neurosurgeon is doing something wrong, something socially irresponsible, why isn't what you're doing socially irresponsible? Okay,
Well-
yeah.
Okay, I'll give one. I mean, my answer, what you're saying reminds me of the old saw that if people fully accepted evolution, they're gonna act like beasts. That's what creationists tell people. But the fact is, they don't act like beasts. People that accept evolution are just as small as other people. So, I mean, you're posing a danger which I demonstrate which I claim is only empirically demonstrated in this questionnaire thing. But anyway, let me talk about what I want to say. So, okay, so thought I was going to go first. So I just had a refresher of the three kinds of views of free will: dualism, non-physiological libertarian free will, which is basically that the mind is independent of the brain. This is what Dan is saying was dispelled a long time ago by everybody. Compatibilism, that free will is compatible with the idea of determinism or laws of physics. And I think that's what most of the people in this room are. I mean, we all agree that the laws of physics reign supreme. So the question is, given that and the form of determinism that entails, do we still have free will? And then Dan is an advocate of compatibilism, as we all saw. Nobody in this room, but a lot of people in this society are advocates of non-physical libertarian free will. And finally, incompatibilism, which is my own view that free will is not compatible with the idea of determinism or the laws of physics. Of course, this depends on what your definition of free will is when you adjudicate between the last two. And I would maintain that compatibilists have redefined free will from its traditional and indigenous meaning in society in a way to either, I think Dan's motivation might be the one to keep people from acting like beasts, as far as I can see.
The only motivation.
Pardon? No, I know there's a long and distinguished history of philosophers saying that, but I didn't really think that was Dan's motivation until I read his Erasmus paper, which he makes this pretty clear that we need to keep this term free will but change its meaning because otherwise society will fall apart.
Except I don't think we're changing its meaning.
Okay, well, all I can say is that I've, my own personal experience and questionnaires, there are conflicting results between different scientific studies about whether people are innately dualists or not. The people I've talked to, when you tell them that their decisions have already been made for them before they make them, are shocked. And when you question them more deeply, you realize that people seem to indeed think that they are agents and they can really make decisions. But that's just my personal experience. So anyway, I'm an incompatibilist. I think that I retain the definition this is my definition of free will. You have to have a definition of free will in order to be able to see whether you're compatibilist or incompatibilist. My definition used to be, which was similar to what Sean was talking about, if you put yourself in the same situation in the same universe with every molecule in the same place, free will would mean that you have the opportunity, that if you come to a decision point, you could make more than one decision. Okay, but then I realized that quantum indeterminacy, if it acts on the neuronal level, could make you make a different decision under those circumstances, and it could even make you make a conscious different decision if that somehow that quantum indeterminacy somehow plays out in your consciousness. So I've taken this definition from Anthony Cashmore in his PNAS paper, the belief that there is something more than the consequences of your genes and your environment to your behavior. And taking into account the possible stochastic effects. Sorry?
I say that's a strange definition.
Well, all it is it's the physicalist or materialist definition of free will. Okay, well, you can contest this. This is meant to be provocative, okay? And I also have to say that I freely admit that I'm not a philosopher, and I've been accused of philosophical naivete, and there's some truth in this. And also what I say about incompatibilism here is not necessarily aimed at the compatibilists in this room. It's just sort of my take on the whole viewpoint. So first of all, let me talk about what I think we all in this room agree on. And I think Dan's talk reinforced this, that there is no dualism, there's no ghost in the machine. The mind is equivalent to the brain. Second of all, we don't have Coynean free will in the sense that I say. We can only make one decision at one time. I really think that's true. Others argue about whether quantum indeterminacy can affect our behavior. As far as I can see, it doesn't, at least from making decisions. So we have to define free will differently to get compatibilism. We can make no decisions other than the ones we do at a given moment unless quantum indeterminacy affects the decision process. If it doesn't, then I think we would all agree if we choose between vanilla or chocolate ice cream at any point, that decision has already been made for us before it reaches our consciousness.
Gary, I think you maybe to short circuit things a little bit. You could deal with this quantum indeterminacy issue just by saying that there is an objective prediction about what you will do next, given by the factors you mentioned. It might be 100% or maybe probabilistic, but it's objective based on your atoms.
Yeah, and that's what Cash wants.
You said we all agree. I don't agree with your last statement about chocolate and vanilla ice cream. I don't think that even on a completely non-dualistic point of view that the decision is made that we will have chocolate or vanilla before we consciously decide that.
Okay, well, there's some neuroscientific experiments. I mean, some people take issue with these about that you can predict which button you're going to press with a certain degree of accuracy before you consciously decide which button you're going to press.
Well, we can discuss those experiments, but they're in a very limited context anyway.
Yeah, okay, well, anyway, given the laws of physics, I claim that this is almost an a priori truth. And finally, we're products of our genes and our environment someway. Okay, my problem with compatibilism is best expressed by Sam Harris. I mean, in some sense, I agree with Dan that we have a manifest image of free will, but I think it's crucial to recognize the reality for other reasons. I mean, Dan wants to keep the manifest image because he thinks society will fall apart if we don't accept it. I think that there are pernicious consequences of not recognizing determinism in terms of our decisions. And my problem is about, what's really going on. People feel that they're the authors of their decisions, and this is the only reason why there's a problem of free will worth talking about. That is, are we really the authors of our decisions? Dan says, no, we're not, but it doesn't matter. Okay, I say
we are the authors of our decisions.
Okay, well,
but we're perfectly material things. We're moist robots who are the authors of our decisions.
Well, in the same sense that a computer is an author of its decision.
Well, but we have to look closely at what kind of computer it is.
Okay, I'm almost done.
Good comparison.
Can you say more about that, Dan?
Yeah, I will, but
All right, sorry. So I think there's a certain number of similarities between sophisticated theology, this is deliberately meant to be provocative and not to really be insulting, but there are some similarities between theologians who don't recognize the truth of the Bible but nevertheless tell it to their flock in order to keep them compliant, and compatibilism. The first one is that both define old notions, in the case of theologians, biblical literalism, in the case of compatibilists, free will, and then claim that nobody really believes these anymore. There are plenty of compatibilists who say nobody's really a dualist. Okay. Second of all, both set humans aside as special. Many compatibilists, I'm not sure the ones in this room, say that only humans have free will and animals don't, computers don't, etc. So we're set aside in that respect. And in both cases, academic doyens sometimes say that it's dangerous for the public to know the truth, either about the fact that our decisions are determined by our environments, our genes, or that maybe God exists as a ground of being rather than as an actual sky father up there. Okay. Should we hide it from the public? This is from Dan's Erasmus paper where he says explicitly that if neuroscience are saying that it is no use, we are already puppets controlled by the environments. They're making a big and potentially harmful mistake. But I think it's true that we are puppets. I mean, we are the puppets of our genes and our environment, and they completely determine what decision we make. So there's another quote below that it's likely to have, which Dan just said, profoundly unfortunate social consequences. And another quote which Dan made on the Point of Inquiry podcast in 2011, we don't want people disabling themselves with bad science. I think this is a very serious issue. Well, I'm not sure that saying that determinism reigns or the laws of physics reign is bad science. And when I see a quote like this, it reminds me of something that Alex said yesterday. My dear descendant from the apes, let us hope it's not true, but if it is so, let us hope it does not become generally known. I.e., let's keep the public unaware of determinism. Okay. We don't really need to know. This is, yeah.
Is it time to?
I'm almost done.
Okay.
This is my next to last slide.
I'll tell you when it's done.
Okay, this is a comment on one of my readers' blog, what we're up against. Human will is not free, but we must not say it is so. So, 2 more slides, actually. Why I think that it is important to concentrate on more than just the manifest image in the case of free will. First of all, and Sean's going to object to this, but Dan, I think, might not, because he says we need to be politically aware of the uses of our language. That if you say we have free will, it somewhat enables religion by making it theists think that the form of free will as proposed by compatibilists is the same as their form of free will, which is truly dualistic. That is, you can choose whether or not to accept Jesus. It misses a critical issue, the absence of dualism and the hegemony of determinism and materialism, i.e. the brain is the mind. I think this is a very important message which we need to get out to the general public. And yet, people who are compatibilists tend to neglect this and say, well, this is the truth, but, we have free will in this other sense. And to me, it's much more important that the public realize this than that they have a conception of free will that comports with determinism, for a number of reasons. I think
Say that last thing again, you say they have a conception of free will that comports with determinism?
Sorry?
Is that what
You
you
said
said?
it's more important that people believe that the mind is the brain than that they have a conception of free will.
Okay.
It comports with determinism, yeah. I think it may have the danger of taking the science out of the question of free will. I mean, people tend to dismiss the Levin experiments and the Sooner-all experiments on grounds more substantial, as far as I can see them, that they don't like the results.
Oh, no, those are, believe me, I will take those experiments
All right.
apart.
All right, well, I mean, this is meant to be provocative and engender
It
discussion.
has been done.
I think it sidesteps the questions of morality and moral responsibility. If we are truly deterministic in our decisions, does the concept of morality and moral responsibility have any meaning at all? I mean, maybe the concept of responsibility does, but not moral responsibility. And I think the most important reason why we have to keep our eye on the true reality rather than the manifest image is because I think it has different consequences for retribution and punishment. I mean, whether or not you punish an 11-year-old for beating his little sister to death depends on what you think, whether you think, what motivated that behavior or not, and did that person behave freely or not.
Well, don't talk about an 11-year-old, talk about
Well, anybody.
anybody.
I mean, I think that your view of remember, I'm a philosophical tyro here, okay? So I'm not going to pretend to know all the nuances, but I think compatibilist free will completely neglects the question, unless you start taking off, will is really determined by our genes or environment, neglects the very important question of how we're going to reform the judicial system of rewards and punishments based on what we know about neuroscience. Okay, and my modest proposal is that we get rid of the notion of free will completely and replace it by this statement, which is from Marvin Minsky. My decision was caused by internal forces I do not understand. And then the really interesting questions to me, which aren't about questions of compatibilism or incompatibilism, what are the effects of determinism on the view of punishment and reward, philosophy and jurisprudence? Does moral responsibility mean anything beyond responsibility, i.e. you did it, you have to go to jail because you're the person that did it, not because you were wrong and you had a choice? How far ahead can we predict decisions before they're made consciously? The ambit of responsibility is science, philosophy, jurisprudence. What are the factors that affect our decisions and how do they play out in the brain? That's a scientific question. And finally, which is a very interesting one, we have a feeling of agency. That is, we can actually make our brains make a choice, which we can't really. Is that feeling of agency a product of natural selection? Why do we feel that we are agents that have free choices? Is that an epiphenomenon? Is that a spandrel? Or is it something that has been installed in our brain by natural selection because, as some scientists think, the feeling of agency is an adaptive one? And then I had a list of questions to hand out to ponder, which I forgot, but I think we have plenty of questions to ponder already, so that's it.
Dan, it might be helpful for you, this little fact, and so the most common excuse in South Africa among murderers caught red-handed is, my ancestors did it.
I wanted to respond to both talks. I'm very much on Dan's side, although in one respect I disagree with him too. I think that any action is the result of a chain of causation. Any action a person takes is a result of a chain of causation. Very often that chain includes conscious decisions. My my coming here is a result of a conscious decision in which I weighed my desire to see you all and to see my family in Lenox. And I went through weighing that against the trouble of air travel on American Airlines and came to a decision. I know, as surely as I know anything, as surely as Descartes knew that he existed, that my consciousness was involved in that decision. Now,
Excuse me, how did you know that? By introspection?
yeah, by experiencing the consciousness, the same way I know I exist. Now, I don't know why I wanted to see my granddaughter so much. I don't really know in detail why I have certain intellectual interests that led me to want to come here. I can trace it back a little bit, but eventually I get to a level where I don't know why I wanted to do what I consciously decided to do. And so it's possible that everything was completely deterministic, and yet part of the chain, the deterministic chain, was a conscious decision.
Except that
Now,
if they put an electrode in your brain and told you before you made your conscious decision that you were going to come here, would that change your mind? That your conscious decision had no role in that?
I don't know whether the electrode would actually change my consciousness. I don't.
You're not denying a correspondence between your decision and your brain state, so that's not.
Yeah,
so
that's
no matter if
right. Of
something
course,
else
it's
is-
my
No,
brain.
I'm denying that.
Well, let's get back to that. And that chain of causation may involve indeterminacy, and here I agree with Dan that it isn't really important whether the quantum effects introduce a indeterminacy or not. But I would go. Now the question. Well, let me come back to that. The question is this a good definition of free will? Namely, that I had the conscious experience of deciding. I think it's a good definition of free will because it's what I care about.
What's free about it?
I consciously decided to come here. That's what's free. That's my definition of free will. Why do I want to define free will this way? Because it's what I care about.
He has
It's because
introspective access to the fact that he could have made the conscious decision not to come. He knew at the point that he made that decision from the inside that it was up to him, the whole history of the world being what it was until that moment, he could
well, I wouldn't quite say that. I would say that no, given
I was hoping to put words in your mouth.
no, given my background with my hormones, which make me want to see my granddaughter, it may very well be I had no choice, but I made the choice. That is, the I, who was conditioned by those hormones, then, as a result of that conditioning, decided to come here. And so I had the conscious experience of making that decision.
But that's not the same as you having made this. I mean, that your brain having that decision.
But that's what I care about, because that conscious experience of making a decision is the kind of free will that seems to me to matter.
Yeah, let me support what Steve is saying. I'm going to give.
But then I want to disagree with you about it.
Okay. All right. But I think I have a different way of putting what I think Stephen is saying. I'm going to give you 4 decisions. Every one of them is caused by the combination of your hormones and your history and your genes and the environment.
This is the one in your Erasmus paper you're going to say.
Yeah.
About cornflakes.
Yeah, right.
I already know that.
All right, but the other stuff. All right, but I have a question for you that I didn't raise in that. So, case 1, my doctor tells me I should eat bran blobs because they're good and healthy for me, and I need to keep my cholesterol down. I trust him, I agree with him, and so I go out and buy some bran blobs of my own free will, as we say, whatever it means. Case number 2, I just go to the store. I read it on the box. It's highlighted in yellow. I trust the Kellogg company. I decide they're probably telling the truth, so I buy the bran blobs. Case number 3, I go into the store, and there's a box of bran blobs with this fetching picture of Cameron Diaz on it, and I buy the box of bran blobs.
Bad taste.
4, I go into the store, and there's a microchip hidden in the box of cornflakes, which tickles my nucleus accumbens, and I buy the box of bran blobs. In every case, the environment has caused me to make a choice. Intuitively, they are profoundly different choices. The first 2, at least, are free choices because although the environment is causing me, they're causing me to use my rational evaluation and to think about what matters to me and what more I want the world to cause me to make decisions like that. So those are just fine. The third case, if I were a really naive person, we could begin to say, the puppeteer is working on you. I'm not a naive person. I know about that. So if I buy it because Cameron Diaz is on the boxes, I'm rewarding the Kellogg's company for their good taste in women. Again, it's free. It's only the fourth case where I'm being manipulated by another agent and I don't know it. There's a puppeteer. And Sam Harris puts those puppet strings on the cover of his book, and that strikes me as sort of intellectually dishonest, actually.
Except that I sort of agree with him, and
I know
really
you
in
do,
your
and you
case,
just said you did.
in your case, if you remember respond, I'd say that there's no substantive difference between those four alternatives. I mean,
Good,
because,
that's what I wanted to, you think there's no more free will in the first two cases than in the last two?
absolutely, yeah, because you're still being manipulated by various factors. It's just it's an
You're using different.
But if you had a brain tumor, it made you like.
Before we,
Oh, okay, sorry.
especially to Steve's counter to Dan. The role of conscious experience. You mentioned Libet, and so did you, and I think we can all agree that Libet's experiments do not establish the denial of free will. But what they do seem to me establish, and I'm interested in being educated if I'm mistaken, is that we cannot trust conscious experience as a guide to what is happening in our Lebenswelt. We can't trust conscious experience to tell us what the causes of our actions are, including when it tells us that conscious willings are the causes of our actions. And that, along with a lot of other evidence, undermines the role of conscious experience as an epistemic guide to a lot of stuff. But do you agree with that, Dan?
I agree with that, except I think you're putting more emphasis on the last conclusion that you draw from. I agree that our conscious experience, our introspective judgments they're not conclusive, they're not privileged, but they are evidence.
They're evidential.
They are evidential.
And the Libet experiments don't undermine them in this case.
Absolutely not. The Libet experiments are misconceived from the ground up.
And all the replications, successful replications,
They
of
are
them
also
misconceived
misconceived
too.
from the ground up.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
I guess I'd like to hear
not only
why.
they're misconceived, I think as you guys have pointed out actually, some of conceptually, but there is a paper that just came out this year that has repeated those experiments.
Oh, yes.
And actually has come to completely different conclusions.
No,
So
that's
it's
not,
not
they
such-
didn't really repeat it. You're talking about these one where they did not, where they just looked at action potential.
Does everybody know about the
Yeah,
Libet
we should probably
experiments?
ask if
Is everybody familiar?
Yeah, I have no idea what
Yeah,
you're talking
so who wants to?
Who wants to be a
Maybe
millionaire?
Owen.
You better not ask me to do it because I've refuted these so many times that I can't do a fair job.
Dan and I thought we got these off the face of the universe by 1990. But I can tell you what it is. Okay, so
Yeah, go ahead.
what Libet does is he pays undergraduates money to come in, and their job is to flex their hand when the urge comes upon them. The motor cortex is being monitored, and they're looking at a clock. What happens is that they're supposed to tell you when they have the conscious urge to flex their hand, and allegedly the action potential, the readiness potential in motor cortex starts to show itself active 250 milliseconds before the conscious urge to flex occurs. John Dylan Haynes says he can see activity that's building up before people make choices to look at the left corner or the right corner of the room, antecedent to conscious intentions. I could comment on my view of these, but it's similar to Dan's.
What it's supposed to show is that the entire causal pathway that is sufficient in the circumstances for the hand flexing or the button pushing or the eye movement has begun significantly before the felt act of willing.
But how do they know when the felt act of willing
Is
is?
the observer?
So there are a couple
The
of,
observer says, that's when I,
yeah,
But
in
that takes
Devitt's original
time.
experiments, there was a large clock with
Yeah,
a
clock
slow
with a-
second-hand sweeping, and you're supposed to
Stop it.
tell where that
yeah, but
clock was
we're talking
when
about a
you.
quarter of a second, right?
Yeah,
And-
it's
and
2/10 of a second
I mean,
before.
for a person to say now takes more than a quarter of a second.
Well, I noticed in these experiments, among many, many other problems, the people have accepted money and consciously loaded up an intention to comply with the experiment.
Oh, I didn't
So
know
it's
that.
a disaster at many different levels. But, I mean, whoever expected, unless you're a dualist, for nothing to be going on in the brain before conscious decision-making or hormones?
But not only that, but it's the predictability, not just the fact that you can tell when something's going to happen, but you can predict whether you're going to use your right or your left hand.
But notice that in all of these experiments, they choose as their model choice an act gratuit, a completely unmotivated, it's a whim. And they rule out the case if you decide in advance, I'm going to
Always
decide
trust
when
the
X or when Y. But now, treating that as our model free choice is in itself bizarre, naive. It's just
Well, it's the
crazy.
beginning.
Well, but look, no, it isn't, because first of all, back to my rock, paper, and scissors. You want to act randomly. Rock, paper, and scissors is a pretty good model of the same thing, right? But how do you do that? Well, you got to make something happen in your brain that you yourself don't have any access to, so that you don't have a poker face, and then boom, you do one. So, in fact, ideally, if Panglossian God were to design you as a free agent to play rock, paper, and scissors, the soon effects would show up in your brain, because you'd want them to show up. You wouldn't want to be able to see the effects churning away in your brain 8 or 10 seconds in advance that was going to determine your choice, because then you'd give it away with your poker face. So what subjects are doing in those experiments is doing something they have no idea what they're doing. They're sitting there going, I don't know. And somehow or other, they manage to provoke something to happen in their brain, which over a course of actually seconds.
Well, they don't provoke it, something else.
Of course.
Money,
Well,
the experimental.
the experimental situation puts them in a condition where something happens in their brain which they can't report, and which is somewhat predictive. There's some real problems with some of the predictiveness. First of all, notice that they're not actually predictive. They're predictive in the scientific sense, but it takes, hours of computation to get the predictions out. I used to say, as a sort of joke, the big moral of the Soon experiment is don't play rock, paper, and scissors for money with Soon with your head in an fMRI machine. But in fact, go right ahead, because it's going to take them an hour or two to analyze the data. So you
Remember, brain, everything is crude. That's not. I mean, Dan, presumably you would disagree with Stephen, and that at the point he made his decision to come here, you would say that decision was already predictable from first principles before he actually was consciously aware of having made that decision.
Well, I think that doesn't matter.
Well, no, I'm asking you yes or no.
Yes, no.
I think you're misstating
Yeah,
what I was saying.
Actually, I'll tell you why not. There's a conditional prediction that I'm sure you could have made, and you could have gotten rich betting on it, namely that he would put all the factors that matter to him in the hopper, and he would say, yeah, I'm going to go. But, of course, if he listens to the radio 10 minutes before he decides and he hears about some crucial thing happening, then he isn't going to go.
Yeah.
So all bets are off. So when did he actually decide? He decided when he decided. And even though, look, suppose that there were political scientists who could study Congress, and 2 weeks in advance, they could predict how Congress was going to vote on a bill. And suppose they were accurate.
They are, no.
Yeah. When did Congress decide?
It gets back to the
When
question
they
if
voted.
money is real.
They decided when they voted. the fact that the
And they should
decision
be
was
punished if they
predictable.
voted wrong.
Okay, well, so Steve listens to the radio and he says the weather's bad, he's not gonna go 10 minutes. For all admit, that's an environmental input. But still, if that decision is 100% predictable before he consciously says, okay, I'm gonna go, I would claim that,
You will claim what?
that his notion of free will is the wrong one.
Can I just ask about the
Because-
notion of free will? Just to see if we can just expand this a little bit. I mean, I think, Dan, you said that you have a compatible notion of free will, and I'm going to try to read from my notes here, but you said one that is very different from what tradition supposes.
Yeah.
Okay,
I quite agree
so-
that there is a tradition which thinks that free will is
The one that-
incompatible.
The one that Jerry put up on the board, I think you're happy to discard, but you want a notion of free will that I think both you and Stephen say one should want, that's valuable, but it's
Yep.
very different
Mhm.
from the way we traditionally
Yep,
view it.
mhm.
And so what I want to get, because I'd be excited to have my, impression of this change, is what is that definition? Because I still haven't quite
Well, for me, it's the
heard it.
it's the fact that a conscious decision process was part of the chain of causation, only a part.
Yeah, 'cause Alex
It's
is
not,
telling me to
it's
put it
not at the
away.
bottom of the chain. It's not the first step in the chain. It's a link in the chain of causation that leads to the action.
Okay,
Let me
can
tell you
I,
about-
can I just add?
I got a two-word
Okay.
definition, which, if you don't get it, I can spell it out at any length you want. Moral competence.
Okay, can I riff
Yeah,
on that?
that's-
Because Hillary Bach isn't here, and I don't know her personally, but I did read one of her writings on this. So can I read her definition? Because I think she makes one, but I haven't completely understood it. So I want to read it and see if people can help me. She says, a person whose actions depend on her choices has alternatives. If she is, in addition, capable of stepping back from her existing motivations and habits and making a reasoned decision among them, then according to compatibilists, she is free. Is that
Pretty close.
Align with
I'd
your
have to
two
think very
definitions?
carefully whether I want to add.
I'm
I
fine.
think I probably want to add a few things.
Let me,
don't
it
think-
might be useful if I think it would help fix, because I understand why Jerry and Dan have this, there's this tension. Let me just tell you about some experiments that have been done, because this has to do with what the concept of free will means. I mean, a philosopher named Eddie Namias, he was a student of mine, actually, and this comes out of his dissertation. He was interested in what do ordinary people mean by free will. And he did these experiments, which are very simple to describe. He gives undergraduates at Florida State and then Georgia State scenarios where there's a Laplacian demon, actually, and it says that Mary Jones will be born in 2000, and in 2034 she'll rob the Lee County Bank at such and such time in downtown Stockbridge of $50,000. And then the undergraduates are asked questions like this.
Berkshire County, not
Did
Lee County.
did she do it on purpose? Is she responsible for it? Did she do it intentionally? And questions like, is she responsible for it, and so on and so forth. Then they end questions like, is it determined that she will do it? Could you have predicted that she would do it? And he finds that 87% of American college students are compatibilists. They think you can disassociate complete predictability and complete determinism from having, she did make a conscious choice. On that day, she wakes up that morning with her plan to go rob the bank. And that was, these students think that's sufficient for saying she did it intentionally, she did it responsibly, and so on. Now notice, the concept of free will is, he's trying to pull out the concept of free will and not make it play any role, because it is so contested, but showing that you get certain, even in a deterministic and fully predictable
Yeah,
world.
there's another paper that came out subsequently which claims that paper is flawed and uses other questions. I can't adjudicate between them, but says that that the students they surveyed are incompatibilists. I should have brought that paper because I have a big folder.
It's Sean Nichols' paper.
I can't remember. But I mean, what you get depends on how you ask the question, so I wouldn't use that.
They're just students anyway.
But surely we have to admit that religious people in general
I'd like
are
to ask a question
dualists.
to both Jerry and Dan and actually Owen over here. So it seems to me that unless I misunderstand some of these positions, that somehow the fact that the brain is evolved to make decisions, to reflect on things, get inputs, and then produce a particular output, seems to be somehow bracketed out of this discussion. Why isn't that a cause that is not by you, but by incompatibilists? That is, why isn't that the brain's ability to reflect and to think about things isn't also that part of the mechanism? And therefore, in an important sense, my decision to come here is my decision because it was made by my brain, which, yes, it is the result, without doubt, of a complex series of gene-environment interactions throughout my life, but it's also a biological machine, if you want to use that analogy. I don't particularly like it, but a biological
there is
mechanism.
a distinction,
to
because
make
your
decisions.
brain may make your heartbeat, you breathe, it may produce reflexes when your knee is hit.
Sure.
That doesn't involve conscious choice. And I don't call that free will, even though it's your brain.
So what's so
I'm sorry.
special about consciousness?
What?
What's so special about consciousness?
Well, that it's part of the decision-making process.
But we don't know that. Consciousness could follow the decision-making
sorry?
process.
So let's try
What else is there?
Here's another distinction that is not, and by the way, I don't propose this distinction as the distinction on the basis of which we'll get the free choices on one side and the other ones, because I don't think there's any such principle. But admitting blurry boundaries, it is an important distinction, I think, when thinking about what matters about free will. So I make some decisions I make by, especially social decisions, or decisions that have some sort of normative significance. I make them partly by asking myself, thinking about what sort of person is it I want to be, what sort of action would be consistent with that sort of person. So the decision is then very much a product of my own sort of narrated self, right? And now that seems to me to implicate my free will in a much more profound way than to thoughtless, than something else that I, when I accidentally drive home while having intended to go to the gym, right? Because I'm not thinking about it. Very different. They're both decisions, in some sense. They were both done by my brain. Right? There was nothing, no brain other than, but from the point of view of what matters about free will, they're very, very different kinds of decisions. Now,
I don't see that.
You can.
It's an input-output problem.
Yeah.
It's just that in one case, the inputs are a lot more complicated.
No, but in one case, in one case, it was my conception of myself. My normatively weighted conception of myself was clearly part of the causal story that explains why I made that decision.
That's what you think.
In the other case, it wasn't.
That's what you think, but I would contend that's not true. Maybe Alex would.
I would say that what the point of view Jerry is advocating is sort of solved by the move that Terry made this morning, which is to say we should remember what we said yesterday. Okay, you keep all that straight. So in other words, if we remember the emergence discussion, and the extent to which we bought into it, there's different levels or vocabularies that describe different parts of experience, and they can describe them in very different ways. And my favorite example is, the atoms and the thermodynamics of the air in this room, and they're so different that features that are absolutely central to the microscopic description might be utterly absent in the macroscopic description. So at the microscopic level of atoms, we have time reversal invariance, right? Everything happens equally well forward and backward in time. And at the macroscopic level, we have the second law of thermodynamics, where there's this dramatic difference. And I would say that free will is to neurons or atoms as the second law is to the atomic theory of gas. It's something that seems incompatible because you're using the wrong vocabulary to talk about it. And I think that your argument against free will, if I followed it step by step, would say there can't be any such thing as the second law of thermodynamics because the atomic physics is completely time symmetric. You're saying there can't be any such thing as free will because down at the level of neurons, everything is just deterministic and I could imagine what it is. And my response would be, you can either speak the language of people and their interactions and their conscious reflection and making choices, in which case free will is a useful concept, or you can speak the language of neurons and action potentials and things like that, in which case everything is deterministic. And those two things are completely simultaneously compatible. And I think that, it seems paradoxical because you say, how can I possibly have free will when my neurons were going to do this?
So
That's sort of
paradoxical because you're using the same word twice.
Well, you're speaking different languages in the same sentence, and I think that's where it goes wrong.
But you agree that there are profound differences for human society. I mean, Dan says if we are incompatible, society falls apart. I would claim that, okay.
That's a great thing to talk about that I want to say has nothing to do with what I just said. I mean,
Okay.
that is interesting to talk about. But let's just be purely, good scholars and say, how should we best describe the world? So my reasons for being a compatibilist are purely that, like I said at the very introductory section, right now, my best theory of human beings at the level of human beings includes free will. And as an empiricist, if there's a better theory of human beings out there that does not require that, I can't imagine what it would be, because I can't imagine speaking a language of human beings that doesn't let me make choices. But I would be happy to get rid of that concept.
Okay, so what is your definition of free will, and then explain what is free about it.
So let me actually. I will answer that, but let me say something that you just reminded me I wanted to say. In exactly the same way that Dan is pointing out that what we mean by free will, even though it's a very useful concept, might be different than what we used to mean by it traditionally, I would say the second law of thermodynamics became different when Boltzmann explained to us that it all comes from atoms. The second law preceded atomic theory, right? And it was thought to be a true tendency of matter.
Yeah, but it was false. It turned out that the second law, phenomenological second law, is false.
It has a domain of applicability which is very, very, very wide. And but more importantly, there's a reason why we still call it the second law, why we didn't invent a different term. But more importantly, its ontological status changed, and we nevertheless kept the terminology. It used to be a true autonomous feature of matter that it wanted to go from lower to higher entropy. And Boltzmann came along and said, no, there is no such tendency. Everything is reversible. It's all just atoms. But in this particular kind of setup, which happens to be our universe in which we live, the second law is still an extremely central way of thinking about reality. So I'm happy to change that definition in that kind of way. So the definition I would give is just pretty close to, I think, what everyone is trying to give from Steve's comments onward. It's the fact that, so if I want to say, will I pick up this glass? Okay, now you might say, well, deep in my neurons and in the environment of the world, there's an answer that Laplace's demon could compute, which is fine. But I will also say, if I decide to pick up the glass, nothing's going to stop me. If I decide not to, nothing's going to force me. That's my free will.
And what's
Can
free
I ask, I'm very interested in what Steve wants to say in response to Dan, but just to ask whether I have a grip on your view, is it a fair gloss on your view to say free will is part of a system of institutions for social control that is important for the persistence of society?
Yes. It's part of the manifest image, and the manifest image for human beings, unlike the manifest image for, say, porpoises or ticks or termites, includes culture and society. And so our understanding of free will is in part a cultural artifact.
In part.
Well, first of all,
free will is in part or in whole a cultural artifact.
No, you also think it's part of the best description we can think of, right?
Yeah, that is deeply embedded in our behavior. I'm going to try to speak very carefully and not load this. If you look at human behavior, if you, anthropologists from Mars, you come here and you look at our behavior, one of the concepts that you are going to impute to us is free will. And you're going to impute it to us on the basis of the role it plays, the distinctions we make, who we punish, who we don't, who we exonerate, who we trust, who we're prepared to make a promise with, and so forth. We take that, if you take all of those facts, and
that exhausts.
And once it exhausts it, given that, we're not just doing anthropology, we're also going to do neuroscience and biology. And we're going to see that manifold of social behaviors are also, of course, have an evolutionary history. They are sitting atop of evolutionary competences. And what we're going to see is that human brains have competences that other brains just don't have.
So that's my question.
Is there any reason, by the
So,
way?
Wait a minute. My question, we're in this human domain,
Yep,
right?
yep.
Okay, so do we have more free will than my dog?
Yes.
Than my bird?
Yes.
So what does it mean?
Actually, I think that Sean put his finger on it indirectly. We, and only we, have two features that your dog and your bird don't have. We have imaginations that can see much farther into the future and value and disvalue those futures. So we have sort of a moral imagination about the outcomes of our acts. And we are movable by reasons, that is, by the representations of reasons. We can be talked into things and talked out of things. The way my doctor talked me into buying Bran Blobs. That's why when I buy a box of Bran Blobs, I'm acting with free will. If my dog eats Bran Blobs, it has no significance.
In other
So-
words, we have a much more sophisticated decision-making organ
Yeah.
Well,
here
another way to
than,
put it-
than the dog.
Yeah.
It's
So
only a
that's-
difference of
that's-
degree,
that's-
it's not a difference in kind.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
it's a difference in degree.
It's a different, it's a difference in degree, sure.
So at some point,
No,
in
I-
the evolution of hominids.
No, I wanna say it's not a
we had
difference in
free
degree.
will and
Is
there any
reason for that we didn't, right?
In fact, not only that, but in individual human cases, we aren't born with free will, we grow into free will.
Yeah.
We become responsible adults.
But now is the problem the word free? Aren't we talking about, we have, you might say in a Shannon sense, there's a higher entropy and a lower bias on that entropy for our choices. That's what you're really saying.
Well-
Not that it's, the term free is what gets us in trouble.
Well,
right?
there is a one place where I definitely do agree with Jerry, which is we should really agree to get rid of talk of free will. Now, cognitive scientists and psychologists have a better term for that. They use the term volition, the ability of making decisions. It's not, and reflect about those decisions. Yes, if you put the word free there, that automatically makes people think about contra-causal stuff, and it floats out of nowhere, the two-bird cartoon. No, none of us wants that, right? No, none of us is actually into that. So let's get rid of that. If you don't like volition, I'm perfectly happy to entertain something else, but I
One
think
very
there's a
important
term.
reason to go with what Massimo says, and this is a point about Dan's Martian anthropologist, is that Dan suggested, and I'm sympathetic with this, that there's something that the Martian anthropologist would want to attribute to us. But actually, if you look at classical Indian philosophy, whether it be Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, or classical Chinese philosophy, there is no concept of free will, as there is none in ancient Greek philosophy. There's a distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior. And that seems much more congenial to evolutionary scientists, because then it will be, and this is congenial usually, I think Dan will find this friendly, and what Terry said about his bird and his dog. I mean, there's some, and what Steve was saying about, say, breathing, respiration, things that are done by the autonomic nervous system and things that are done in other ways by humans. Some are happenings and some are actions. Some are voluntary and some are involuntary. I think if one looks at the history of the concept of free will in the West, it is so tied in with theology. It's invented at a time when there's faculties, when the mind is being considered as divided into certain faculties, and in addition, and I think this is where Jerry's right, radical libertarian autonomy is considered is necessary for God not to be a prick, for either rewarding or punishing you for all eternity. It's just, so I do think that there's a clearly a strong strain in our tradition of this particular concept of free will. I think it's such a hybrid concept. I do think that there's a way out, and other cultures haven't needed it. They do the same work. They reward and punish, and they think about people as culpable or non-culpable for their actions. But it does clearly, and I think this is on Dan's side, this part is that part of one criteria is that things that I do are usually preceded by conscious, their proximate cause, it looks like that, is some kind of conscious volition. And sometimes reasoning, and sometimes thinking about the kind of person I want to be.
Something that hasn't been mentioned and this does connect, of course, with what we discussed yesterday. Once one takes Massimo's point on board, right, and recognizes that no, when the defender of free will should not be defending this magical, instant, timeless little event. The decisions are real processes done over real time by brains that can take minutes or days or hours or years. Once we recognize that, then it seems to me the only reason, any reason to be skeptical of whether that kind of free will exists is going to be a reason to be skeptical about any kind of causation except the micro-bangings that analytic metaphysicians' ideas of fundamental physics traffic in, right? I mean, it's so you're into the whole, among analytic, for the non-philosophers here, among analytic metaphysicians, there's a common view that baseballs can't break windows, right? Because, after all, most of the baseball didn't come into contact with the window, right? Only some molecules of the baseball came into contact with some molecules of the window, right? A baseball is a big macroscopic object. It can't do anything, right? Only the sort of smallest components of the baseball can do things.
Unfair to analytic metaphysics.
We have to
let it
air our
pass.
dirty
But it's crazy. But this is crazy. And similarly, I mean, so a little bit more seriously than the baseballs and windows stuff, there's well-known philosopher Jaegwon Kim argues there's no mental causation at all, right? Thought doesn't.
No, he does not argue that, Don. That's completely unfair. He argues that mental causation is physical causation. Yeah.
Well, he winds up as an eliminativist, Alex.
No.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does.
These are niceties that we don't have.
He's got the problem of overdetermination. We don't
Yeah.
want to go there.
The point is, I don't see the central point is, right, it seems to be the only reason to be doubtful of free will, once we take Massimo's point on board, is going to be a reason to be doubtful of all macro-level causation.
Or actually, when you just say if you take the micro banging around view, then you would just say something like conscious mental causation is epiphenomenal. Would that be the challenging view? That's a view that Alex
I think it's exactly, I mean, if there were people who said that baseballs don't break windows because most of the molecules don't hit the window, I think they would be making exactly the mistake of using molecule talk in a discussion about baseballs. And so I will retract my previous opining that there's no such thing as causality in the world for exactly that reason. I think time is a different thing, so I got excited by that. But causality, I think, you can make a case that exists in the macroscopic world, subject to the second law and so forth, and it disappears at the level of Schrodinger's equation or whatever. But it's real in the same exact sense that baseball is real as a sport and free will is real as a way of thinking about
I wonder why
human.
people aren't willing to do what Massimo says, and I suggest get rid of the term free will.
I would be very open to that.
Well, let me talk about that because all right, I'm gonna say all right, I could imagine getting rid of it, and I would replace it with something like morally competent volition. And
It's not going to win any popularity contest.
No. Exactly
Well,
not.
how about voluntary or involuntary?
but every term in that is important. It's not just competent volition; it's competent enough to be held responsible, and it's not absence of causation. It's that my volitions are caused, to advert to the sort of points that Stephen was making. My volitions are caused, for the most part, not all of them, but the ones that matter, the ones that are morally relevant, by my evaluation of reasons that I have obtained by processes of inquiry, and I am a responsible gatherer of information, and I'm a responsible protector of myself from manipulating agents. I am on the constant, it's not a big deal, I don't want to be manipulated by other agents.
So if Charles Whitman, for example, and it could be possible that he killed 16 people because he had a brain tumor that made him aggressive.
Yeah,
Okay, so he is, you would not hold him responsible for what he did, because he had no.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say that in the case
But
of Charles Whitman,
he has to be kept, he has to be
I
sequestered.
don't know.
Oh,
that I
sure.
would hold
Oh,
him
look,
responsible.
lots of people are dangerous.
Yeah.
Lots of people are
No,
dangerous.
I don't know that, I don't agree that I wouldn't hold him responsible. I don't know exactly what the effect of the brain tumor is, If the brain tumor makes him think that he's not really killing anyone, then I wouldn't hold him responsible.
Yes.
But if the brain tumor gives him a strong desire to kill people, then I hold him responsible.
That he can't overcome.
Well,
What if you could remove the brain tumor?
what?
What if you could remove the brain tumor? Would you still hold him responsible afterward?
I mean, then he's a different person. I don't know.
The
That's
the
hard.
question is, could we?
hard,
Yeah.
I
I mean,
agree.
it's all the could piece, right? That's where it's all hiding.
I think that we have a better theory of Charles Whitman than a freely operating thing, right? Where, you know, the theory that he'll go kill people is better than one that he's making rational decisions based
Well,
on.
that's
that.
I mean, my
Our
feeling
colleague,
is, yeah.
Senator Armstrong has a detailed case of someone who was a repeated sex offender
Yeah.
and who was diagnosed as having a tumor that was impressing a certain part of the brain. When it was removed, he ceased entirely to behave in these inappropriate way towards his daughter. He was subsequently released from jail. The tumor regrew back, and as it grew back, his behavior returned to its previously indictable pattern. And again, on the removal of the tumor, his behavior returned to normal.
So there's
Now, what does one make of this from the perspective of retributive punishment?
Well, I'm puzzled by the question that Sean asked, which you're also asking. If the tumor is out, is he the same person that did the
He
crime?
himself actually had a first-person account of the entire train of events, which made it clear that from the first person, he thought of himself as numerically identical over the repeated interventions, the criminality, the trials, and the ultimate cure.
Did he say why he did the foul deeds when he
said,
had
"I
the
had
tumor
an
in?
overwhelming desire to
Wow.
do these deeds." And of course, he knew nothing about his brain tumor initially, and the subsequent overwhelming desires came upon him in ways that did not reveal that they were caused by the recurrence of the brain tumor, but which his physicians were able to diagnose.
But you see, that's key. I think when the question of the responsibility of this man comes up, the question is whether he had evidence for the recurrence. Was there a time when he should have known
That
that
owing
he
to his
was
behavior
becoming
alone.
disabled, and then we can say he's responsible for not having taken the steps?
The second time.
Yeah.
I just want to follow up. So the clearest way for me to accept free will, I think, is the one I got from Sean. And I just want to do the argument out quickly. So there may be apparent properties of a social theory or moral theory that are in contradiction to the apparent properties of an underlying theory. And so
Apparent contradiction.
there are these properties. And so in the example is the second law. So the base properties are time invariance. The emergent properties are time
Time symmetric.
time
asymmetrical.
Time asymmetric. Thank you. Yeah. So that makes it possible to believe in free will.
Right.
But just because it's possible to have theories up here that have totally unfound physical properties doesn't mean we should.
That's right.
And then the should comes from Dennett saying, I don't want to parody you, but I'm forced to. Just that the reason we should attribute these magical properties,
Not magic.
They're not magical.
the reason we should
Emergent.
Objection.
so no emergence has been demonstrated. No derivation has been done.
No more magical
It's
than the second law of
possible.
thermodynamics.
No. It is magical because we're just saying it is not logically impossible. The derivation could happen, but we haven't done a derivation.
But Dan does have a theory of consciousness, right? And the theory of consciousness, Dan's theory of consciousness is supposed to, among other things, sort of tell us what this volition is like
You're also
and how it
describing the
works.
fact that we have
How
experience
it
of
works.
volition.
Having people have experiences of all sorts of things that we don't believe are true.
Yeah, but
It's-
that's not ground for dismissing experience across the
No,
board.
but it's also not ground for believing. I want to be careful here, but so I can believe in spirits at the high level. I just say they're emergent properties, and they're in contradiction to underlying properties, but we don't want to just say anything goes at this upper level.
No.
No, but that's the point. They are
Yeah.
in actual contradiction to the underlying laws in the way that violations of conservation of energy would be. Not apparent contradiction caused by the fact that the domain of applicability is small enough.
How can what's the principle by which we distinguish between apparent and actual contradiction?
Well, I think, if you believe that energy conservation. The first law of thermodynamics, for example.
Which came after the second law.
It did, but we would not want to lose it on the road from the micro theory to the macro theory if we truly had, we know enough about the macro theory to say the first law of thermodynamics should survive that transition, even if we couldn't do the derivation step by step. And likewise, I think we can rule out life after death because we know enough about the micro theory to say, there's no place for the information about your mental states to go once you die. Whereas free will, all I'm saying about free will is it seems to me to be part of the best macroscopic theory I have for describing human beings. If we want to replace the idea with a better idea like either a vocabulary term like volition or even a better description of human beings, I'd be all for that because I can't derive it. That's fine.
I do think it's important not to leave this discussion thinking that the sort of settled view coming from Dan is the neuroscientific arguments against fail because they're philosophically naive, and free will is really important politically and culturally. Therefore, we should be compatibilists, right? In addition, there's this other big piece in there. Dan has a theory of the conscious, volitional human being, right? And which is designed, among other things, to be a sort of explanation sketch for how evolution produced it and how it computes, how its brain produces its mind, and how its brain, in interaction with the environment, produces meaningful self-narratives and produces selves of the kind that can be authors of their own activity. So all that stuff's really quite important too, right? If we had no story like that, we'd be much more worried.
It's not just compatible.
Yeah, Jerry, somebody wrote a paper recently, somebody wrote a book recently called My Brain Made Me Do It. Now, you take a deep breath and think about this. What else would you want to make you do it? But more seriously, there are ways your brain could make you do it, and then there are other ways your brain could make you do it. And the trick is, which kind of way is it? The intermediate theory that Dawn is talking about is the one which takes on that challenge and says, if this is how your brain makes you do it, you're responsible, that you're a morally competent individual. That's what we all want to be true of ourselves, and guess what, folks? It's possible. We can be wired right.
Well,
if your brain made you do it in some other way, then you're wired wrong, and then you aren't responsible.
Well, I don't think there's different ways your brain makes you do it. I mean, maybe this is radical, but substantively, I don't think there's any difference between somebody killing somebody or being a pedophile because they have a brain tumor, or somebody killing somebody because they were beaten up as a kid, which affected their neurons in such a way that they had no choice but to be angry and go out and kill somebody. And lies seamlessly through all levels of human.
And so also with the person who decides to commit a crime and then commits a murder to cover the crime when he just simply thought he could get away with it. You don't think there's any difference with that brain either?
I don't.
Jerry, so it's interesting you put it that way because, and I have encountered that often, this argument that for all effective purposes there is no substantive distinction between somebody committing murder because of the brain tumor and somebody committing murder because, you wanted your cash or whatever it is, right?
Because of molecular
but that to me is,
causation.
right. Of course there is a causal story to be told there. But again, it seems to me, first, two things. First of all, if you take seriously the idea that the human brain is a organ to make decisions, then the situations actually are different. There are different inputs into the brain, there are different circumstances. The brain elaborates that information differently. And in one case, there's more constraints imposed, like the tumor, there's more constraints imposed on that brain. The brain is malfunctioning. And so one of the things that I really am puzzled often by that, the brain tumor argument is that the brain tumor is clearly a case where I think most of us would agree the brain is not working properly. It's wired up wrongly. And so that case cannot possibly be representative, I think, of a general way.
Childhood trauma then?
Well, so that's an interesting one. So I was just thinking when you mentioned that. So the case of childhood trauma, I'm making stuff as I go in a moment, but surely some neurobiologists could back this up. That one might be intermediate. That might be a situation where the constraints imposed on your brain are going to be less than the tumor, but more than a normal person who grew up with.
What a normal brain is. I mean, we all have causes for what we do. I I mean, my view is that there is
Causes, yes,
responsibility.
but there is a curve. There is a bell curve. So your tumor is over here, and your incredibly good education, nurturing environment, everything is going out. Is over there, and then there's the rest of us. And
Yeah.
I don't understand the distinction between your word responsibility and moral responsibility. I mean,
Because responsibility can remedy by simply because moral responsibility engenders retribution, it seems to me. I mean, I don't see what is added.
You're responsible, you go to jail.
Yes.
Why is that not retribution? I mean, it's true that there are other reasons for putting people in jail, which may not, including deterrence and so on.
Yeah.
But you are not talking about deterrence, you are talking about responsibility. I don't see the difference.
When somebody's responsible, it means that, for example, if that means that they may be liable to do it again. If you could determine absolutely that this crime was a one-time thing and they'd never again, then you wouldn't put them in jail.
By responsibility, you mean prevention, that
Yeah,
you prevent the act from being done again.
There's only two reasons I see for punishment.
All right, before you say them, Jerry, I will play the role of the coffee police. I will let Jerry say his two reasons, and then
May I make one legal summary before that, please?
I'm not a very good policeman, I guess. Okay, so Jerry can say his two reasons, and then you can summarize.
Deterrence and rehabilitation, that's it.
Okay.
I think that the conversation on law, let me just comment on that, I think it's been really muddy, so I want to have my say on this. If somebody commits a crime, you would need to discuss whether or not there's mens rea volition. I like the volitional word better. Whether or not there really is volition or free will, we can't have society without having that construct, so I think we got to have that. So you got to determine whether or not there was criminal intent. You're making up cases that are very much on the line. I think it's pretty irrelevant. Those are very unusual and special cases. And the idea of convicting somebody is for several purposes, in my view. One is deterrence. You want to keep people from committing a crime again. Another is removing people from society who, in fact, are non-rehabilitatable. I think the goal needs to be rehabilitation. If you guys really want to punish people and take their fingernails off because you're mad at them, I want to put that aside. I personally don't subscribe to that. I also think that this level of responsibility extends to 11-year-olds. If an 11-year-old commits a crime, you also need to determine these same things. You need to deter that behavior. You may do it differently. You need to remove them from society potentially, and you try to rehabilitate them. And by the way, if it turns out that they didn't have criminal intent, but they might kill again, you have to lock them up by reason of insanity, which has the same kinds of purposes as, in fact, locking them up because they had volition. And finally, of course, there's negligence, which has another set of potential. So if you say, well, they didn't mean it, but they did something bad because they were stupid, there's civil law that deals with that. So I want to kind of remove all these legal questions, which frankly I've heard a lot of very muddy approaches to. That's my view on the legal side. And all of that is assuming that we are dealing as if there were free will. And I'm not convinced by any of you whether or not there is. I don't know about that. I'm not sure from listening to any of this you can ever determine that. But I think for practical purposes, going along with Sean, I'm a Seanist on this, but those are my legal views.
Could I just apologise? I'm having to leave because I've got to get back and I'm frightened of being trapped. So thank you all very much, and thank you to Nick. I just want to leave you with this 4-line poem by Pete Hine. Nature, it seems, is the popular name for milliards and milliards and milliards of particles playing their infinite game of billiards and billiards and billiards.
Who wrote that?
Pete Hine.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And so Richard is leaving, I guess, but everyone else raise their hand if they want to be in the dinner party, 7:30 tonight. 1, 2, 3, 4.